words of my mouth and the meditation of all of our hearts be pleasing to you, O Holy One. Amen. Jesus had to suffer and die. This teaching is at the heart of the Christian tradition. When the first disciples are trying to come to terms with the meaning of Jesus' death by crucifixion, this was their conclusion. It was necessary. Exactly why it was necessary has been the subject of theological treatises and more books than I can mention, to take away the sins of the world, to show that he was fully human, as the cost of confronting the dominant political powers with the message of God's love, in order to triumph over death. And these are just a few of the ways that his suffering has been interpreted. The tradition has made sense of his suffering and death. And it's really important that we get this sorted out for ourselves. How we think about suffering. Our theology, our spirituality of suffering is crucial. This is what Jesus is trying to do with Peter in the first part of the reading this morning. I'm not going to deal with the second part, but the first part, Peter can't imagine that the Messiah should suffer. You know, Jesus says, well, I'm going to suffer and die, and 3 days be raised again. And Peter says, God forbid it, not you. And probably in Peter's mind is thinking, well, if Jesus has to suffer and I'm supposed to model Jesus, that means I have to suffer. And I thought this was all about not having to suffer anymore. So he didn't want to let it in at all. And Jesus was saying, you're wrong, Peter. There's no getting around it. He said, you're looking at this from the perspective of a human mind, not from a divine perspective. And what Peter did then is one extreme end of a continuum about how we think about suffering. And that is that, well, maybe the truly enlightened never have to suffer. Maybe that's the goal of the spiritual life, to get to a place where there is no suffering. Well, that's not quite the way it is. But this morning, it's the other end of the spectrum that I'm centrally concerned with. For too long, the Christian life has been associated with joylessness. There's a real temptation to glorify suffering, to make suffering a virtue in and of itself. And it's difficult, right? Because, I mean, you come here every Sunday, if you do, and hovering above us is this image of the cross. And, well, there's Jesus, and so maybe that's what we're called to do, is just basically suffer. That's how you get close to Jesus. Suffer. I think this is a theological mistake. It doesn't reflect Jesus' deep Jewish roots, and his Jewish roots said the predominant sentiment for those who are living life in the Spirit is not joylessness. It's joy. You're in God. Celebrate. I mean, we're called to celebrate. But we have imagined that, you know, we kind of talk about we have to follow Jesus to the cross, and that means, I guess, you know, we should suffer all the time if we're a real Christian. Agnes Goncha Bojaksu, an Albanian Roman Catholic nun, dedicated her life to caring for the destitute and the dying in the streets of Calcutta. We know her as Mother Teresa. Since her death, her private letters to friends and to priests have been published, and so we have access to them as the public. And these letters have forced us to radically rethink what she was about. In these letters, we see a distinctly different portrait than most of us have cherished. A saint, selflessly yet joyfully dedicated to serving the destitute and the dying. In fact, she not only died deeply depressed, feeling abandoned by God, and without any faith whatsoever, she lived 40 years of her life like this while she was doing it. This is a quote from a book that was released last year, Mother Teresa, Come Be My Light. In it, she says in one of these letters, people say they are drawn closer to God, seeing my strong faith. Is this not deceiving people? Every time this happened, I wanted to tell the truth that I actually have no faith. And this is only one quote from these letters. There are a whole bunch of them. So it's, it's deeply disturbing for us. What do you do with this information? And the path to her loss of faith and to her deep depression involved an intrinsic belief in the virtue of suffering itself. She glorified suffering. Despite the hundreds of millions of dollars that came her way, and often came her way through, not so respectable sources, dictators and companies who were trying to put a good spin on some of the bad they had done in the world. All of her convents that she built were generally considered to be decrepit. Her sisters reused needles. The suffering and the dying were not given any painkillers. All of the money went into building new mission centers, and the explicit purpose of these mission centers were to convert the dying, to save the souls of those who were dying to the Catholic faith. She was winning souls for Jesus, to help the poor get to heaven. In the words of Davidson Lower, she was not necessarily setting up places to provide the best medical care for people or provide pain relief for suffering and dying. Sometimes she showed the people that the more they suffered, the closer they were to Jesus. And so I've often wondered, how come she's not the least bit interested in women's rights? Or in contraception, which could alleviate so much of this suffering? She was against it. Why wasn't she interested in the social causes of poverty? All this suffering, including her own depression, was seen, and even her loss of faith, was seen as her way of participating in Christ's redemptive purposes. She called this, quote, being a victim of God's love. And this is what brought you closer to Jesus. Now, I'm not saying here that Mother Teresa didn't do any. Obviously, she did a whole lot of good for those kids that, for those babies that no one else was caring for. I'm not saying that at all. But I am saying that her theology of suffering, the way she thought about suffering, prevented her from doing so much more good, and that is addressing the actual causes of suffering. It doesn't do us any good to glorify suffering. Because being human, as Jesus was saying, clearly involves suffering. Bad things happen. Illness strikes. Tragedy sideswipes us. And it's possible to understand the meaning of the whole Christian spiritual journey as a journey to enter deeply and authentically into our own suffering as possible, so that we can actually be transformed by the experience in order that we might alleviate the causes of suffering in the world. That could be an apt description of Christian life, right there. My own belief is that Jesus didn't actually choose to suffer death by crucifixion.